2个8星期，我是中国海军五司令，已接近我黄岩岛领空，为避免误判，立即远离。
加强对海面目标观察任务，明白。
China has just warned 3 Philippine aircraft over Scarborough Shoal after the PLA Southern Theater Command said it tracked and monitored an islander, a C-208 and a PA-31T, before issuing radio warnings on August 21. Beijing says the aircraft entered what it considers Chinese territorial airspace over Huangyandao without authorization, and warned that the incident could lead to misunderstanding and miscalculation. But there is one detail that makes this much more important than another South China Sea warning. Scarborough Shoal has already gone through a major escalation on the water, and now the confrontation is moving into the air. For years, the contest around this tiny feature was dominated by fishing boats, Coast Guard ships, blocking maneuvers and water cannon incidents. Then, on August 1, China conducted joint naval and air patrols around Scarborough, bringing PLA air and naval forces directly into the picture. Now, just weeks later, 3 Philippine aircraft have been tracked and warned by Chinese naval and air forces. So the question is no longer simply who claims Scarborough Shoal. The more urgent question is whether this small disputed feature is becoming a multi-domain flashpoint, where Coast Guards, naval forces, and aircraft are increasingly operating in the same contested space, and where one mistake could turn a controlled gray zone confrontation into a much bigger crisis. Look at Scarborough Shoal on a map, and it does not look like the kind of place that should become the center of a major confrontation between China and the Philippines. It is a small group of reefs and rocks in the South China Sea, located roughly 220 kilometers from the Philippine island of Luzon. But its physical size tells you almost nothing about its strategic importance. For the Philippines, Scarborough sits close enough to Luzon to matter directly to fishermen, maritime security, and national sovereignty. For China, the feature is part of a much wider effort to assert its maritime claims and maintain a persistent presence in the South China Sea. And because the shoal sits in a strategically important part of the sea, whoever can operate around it with greater freedom gains more than simply access to a patch of ocean. That is why Scarborough has become such a recurring flashpoint. The important question has gradually changed from who says they own it to who can actually operate around it. And that distinction is critical. A country can maintain a legal claim on paper, but if its vessels cannot freely reach the area, cannot protect its fishermen, and cannot maintain a regular operational presence, the practical balance can begin to look very different. That is the contest now unfolding around Scarborough. The modern confrontation around Scarborough cannot be understood without going back to 2012, when China and the Philippines became locked in a major standoff over the feature. After that confrontation, Chinese maritime forces established a much more persistent presence around Scarborough, fundamentally changing the operational reality in the area. The dispute then moved into the legal arena. In 2013, the Philippines initiated arbitration proceedings under the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea against China. 3 years later, the Arbitral Tribunal issued its landmark 2016 ruling.
The new government here in Manila is grappling with what might be called catastrophic success. What comes next is obviously going to be a delicate balancing act.
Rejecting the legal basis for China's claimed historic rights over extensive areas of the South China Sea, and addressing Chinese actions affecting Philippine maritime rights. But there is an important distinction that often gets lost in political discussion. The tribunal did not simply issue a ruling saying that Scarborough Shoal's sovereignty belonged to the Philippines. China rejected the arbitration ruling and continues to reject it. The legal dispute therefore never disappeared. Instead, it continued alongside something much more tangible: the increasing Chinese operational presence around the shoal. And that is where the story becomes much more interesting. Because while diplomats continued arguing over legal claims, ships were changing what happened on the water. The confrontation around Scarborough gradually became less about occasional diplomatic statements and more about daily operations. Chinese Coast Guard vessels began maintaining persistent patrols around the feature. Philippine vessels continued trying to operate in the area. Fishing activity continued. Encounters became more frequent, and Manila repeatedly accused Chinese vessels of dangerous maneuvers and other coercive actions, including water cannon incidents, while Beijing continued to describe Philippine activity as unauthorized intrusion into what it considers Chinese waters. This created a new reality. The question was no longer simply whether China or the Philippines had a claim. The question was whether Philippine vessels could operate around Scarborough without being challenged. That is a much more consequential contest because it is about operational access.
Based on our monitoring, the actual number of Coast Guard vessels that we saw when we did the MDA flight, there were 4 China Coast Guard vessels, 2 PLA Navy vessels, and 6 Chinese maritime militia.
If Chinese Coast Guard ships can repeatedly approach Philippine vessels, block their movement, issue warnings, and establish a constant presence, Beijing can increase its practical influence without needing to occupy the shoal itself. This is the logic of gray zone competition. The pressure is persistent, but carefully managed. The objective does not necessarily require a dramatic military operation. It can come from repetition. Patrol after patrol. Encounter after encounter. Warning after warning. And eventually, the operational environment itself begins to change. But in August, something new happened. The PLA entered the picture much more visibly. On August 1, China's military conducted joint air and naval combat patrols around Scarborough Shoal, according to the PLA Southern Theater Command. The drills involved China's naval and air forces and were presented by Beijing as an effort to improve combat readiness and defend what China describes as its territorial sovereignty and maritime rights. That exercise was important because it demonstrated something beyond ordinary Coast Guard activity.
查对海面目标，快看到我，明白。
It showed multi-domain coordination. Ships were operating. Aircraft were operating. The PLA was publicly signaling its ability to coordinate those forces around Scarborough. That does not mean China was preparing to attack the Philippines. There is no basis for making that claim. But it does demonstrate that Beijing is willing to place military capabilities directly into the strategic picture around a feature that has traditionally been dominated by maritime law enforcement confrontations. And then came August 21. 3 Philippine aircraft, PLA tracking, radio warnings, and a new dimension to the confrontation. According to the Chinese military, the 3 Philippine aircraft, an Islander, a C-208, and a PA-31T, entered what Beijing describes as China's territorial airspace over Huangyan without approval. The PLA Southern Theater Command says it deployed naval and air forces to track and monitor the aircraft and issue verbal warnings. That is China's account, and it is important to present it precisely that way. The question of sovereignty and the legal status of the surrounding airspace is disputed. China's assertion should not be presented as an internationally settled fact. But regardless of the competing legal positions, the operational development is clear. Chinese military forces tracked Philippine aircraft over a disputed feature and issued warnings. That matters because aircraft are fundamentally different from ships. A ship can slow down. A ship can turn. A ship can shadow another vessel. A ship can stop. An aircraft does not have the same luxury. Aircraft travel at much higher speeds. operate in 3 dimensions, and can close distances extremely quickly. A dangerous interception or misunderstanding in the air can therefore develop much faster than a confrontation between 2 surface vessels. That is precisely why China's own statement emphasized the possibility of misunderstanding and miscalculation, and now the question becomes unavoidable. Is Scarborough evolving from a maritime flashpoint into a multi-domain flashpoint? We cannot know Beijing's private intentions with certainty, so this has to be treated as strategic analysis rather than established fact. But the pattern is becoming increasingly visible. First comes persistent presence, then pressure, then warnings, then military signaling, and now air activity. China does not necessarily need to make one dramatic move around Scarborough to strengthen its position. Instead, it can gradually establish expectations about what activity it will tolerate and how it will respond when Philippine forces operate in the area. The Coast Guard can challenge ships. The PLA can conduct exercises. Military aircraft can monitor Philippine aircraft. Warnings can establish a pattern of behavior. Over time, the message becomes increasingly clear. China wants to make its presence around Scarborough an established operational reality. That does not mean China has uncontested control. The Philippines continues operating there. But the contest becomes increasingly difficult for Manila because every operation carries a greater possibility of confrontation. And that is the heart of gray zone strategy. The objective is not necessarily to eliminate the other side's presence. It can be enough to make that presence increasingly costly and increasingly risky.
701. In accordance with the Republic Act 12064, the Philippine Maritime Zones Act.
Manila faces an equally difficult problem. If the Philippines stops operating around Scarborough, Chinese presence could become increasingly normalized, and Beijing could gain greater practical control over the area without having to make a dramatic move. But if Manila continues sending aircraft and vessels into the area, the probability of another dangerous encounter increases. That leaves Philippine policymakers caught between 2 risks. Backing down can gradually change the operational balance. Pushing forward can increase the danger of confrontation. This is why Philippine activity around Scarborough cannot simply be dismissed as provocation or described as an attempt to start a conflict. Manila has strategic reasons to continue demonstrating that Chinese warnings do not automatically determine Philippine behavior. Maintaining presence can serve several purposes at once: supporting Philippine maritime claims, demonstrating operational access, monitoring Chinese activity, and preventing Chinese control from becoming completely normalized. But there is a price. Every additional encounter creates another opportunity for something to go wrong. And that becomes even more important now that aircraft are entering the equation. At sea, even a dangerous confrontation usually gives both sides at least some room to react. A Coast Guard ship can slow down, change course, back away, or try to create distance if the situation starts getting out of control. That does not make encounters between Chinese and Philippine vessels safe. Far from it, but there is at least a little more time for the crews involved to see what is happening and respond before things get worse. An aircraft encounter is a different story. 2 aircraft can close the distance incredibly quickly, and a maneuver that one pilot considers routine can be interpreted very differently by the other side. A warning over the radio can be misunderstood, a pilot can react to a radar contact in a way the other side did not expect, or one aircraft can move into a position that suddenly leaves very little room for correction. Neither side has to be looking for a fight for an incident like that to become dangerous. And that is what makes the August 21 incident worth watching. The concern is not necessarily that Beijing or Manila wants to turn Scarborough Shoal into a military confrontation. The bigger problem is that both sides are trying to demonstrate that they will not simply back down, while each is also hoping the other side understands where the limits are. The danger comes when those limits are interpreted differently. At that point, something that begins as a routine warning or interception can become an accident. And an accident around a disputed area involving military aircraft could create a crisis much faster than either side intended. That is why the move from ships to aircraft matters. Scarborough is no longer just a place where Philippine and Chinese vessels are testing each other's limits on the water. Military aircraft are now becoming part of that same confrontation. And that gives both sides much less room for error. The United States should not be brought into this story too early, because the immediate confrontation is between China and the Philippines. But once aircraft and military forces become involved, the U.S. Philippines alliance becomes increasingly relevant. The Philippines is a U.S. treaty ally, and the two countries' 2023 bilateral defense guidelines explicitly address threats across land, sea, air, space, and cyberspace, while also recognizing gray zone and hybrid activities. That does not mean a Chinese warning to Philippine aircraft automatically triggers American military intervention. It does not. The significance is deterrence. The more dangerous encounters around Philippine forces become, the more important it becomes for both Beijing and Manila to consider what a serious incident could mean for the wider alliance relationship. A collision involving a Philippine aircraft would be very different politically from a verbal warning. An aircraft damaged during an encounter would be different again. A Philippine military aircraft attacked deliberately would create an entirely different strategic calculation. The alliance therefore exists in the background of every increasingly dangerous encounter, even when American forces are not directly involved. And that is why risk management around Scarborough matters far beyond the shoal itself. The deeper story is no longer simply about territory. It is about access. China is trying to establish a persistent operational presence. The Philippines is trying to prevent that presence from becoming uncontested. The Coast Guard has become a major instrument of the confrontation. The PLA has demonstrated that naval and air forces can operate around the feature. And now Philippine aircraft are being tracked and warned. Put those developments together, and the pattern becomes much easier to see. Scarborough is becoming a test of operational freedom. Who can fly there? Who can sail there? Who can patrol there? Who can fish there? Who can conduct surveillance? And who has the ability to make the other side reconsider before entering the area? That is the competition now. The first possibility is controlled gray zone pressure. China continues tracking and warning Philippine aircraft, while its Coast Guard continues confronting Philippine vessels. But both sides carefully avoid crossing the threshold into a major military incident. This would be tense, repetitive, and dangerous, but still manageable. The second possibility is increasing military enforcement. More Chinese aircraft appear. More naval forces operate around Scarborough. Coast Guard patrols become more persistent. Warnings become more frequent. And China's practical control over the surrounding operating environment gradually becomes harder for Manila to challenge. That would represent a significant shift even without a formal seizure of the feature. The third scenario is the one nobody wants. An air incident, a close intercept, a collision, a communication failure, a radar misunderstanding, an aircraft forced into an unsafe maneuver. One accident could transform a carefully managed gray zone confrontation into a major diplomatic and military crisis. And once that happens, the calculations change. The question would no longer be simply whether China or the Philippines has a stronger claim. The question would become how both governments respond to an incident involving military aircraft. And that is where escalation becomes much harder to control. This is why China's warning on August 21 deserves attention. Beijing itself emphasized the possibility of misunderstanding and miscalculation. That language is revealing because it points toward the most dangerous feature of the current situation. The biggest threat may not be that either side deliberately decides to start a war over Scarborough. The bigger threat is that each side continues testing the limits of the other until an accident crosses a line nobody intended to cross. The Coast Guard confrontations have already created a pattern of physical risk. The August 1 naval and air drills added a military dimension. The August 21 aircraft incident added direct air-to-air interaction. And that means Scarborough is becoming increasingly crowded with different forms of power operating in the same contested space. The more actors and platforms involved, the more complicated the escalation ladder becomes. So what actually changed on August 21? Not the legal dispute. That has existed for years, not the Chinese claim. That also existed long before this incident. What changed is the operational environment. The confrontation around Scarborough has evolved from a dispute dominated by Coast Guard presence and maritime pressure into one where naval and air forces are now becoming more visible parts of the equation. On August 1, China conducted joint naval and air patrols around the shoal. On August 21, the PLA said it tracked and warned 3 Philippine aircraft over Huangyandao. And between those events sits the much longer history of Chinese Coast Guard pressure and Philippine efforts to maintain access. That is the progression. Coast Guard pressure military drills air confrontation. And that is why today's incident deserves attention. The story is no longer simply who claims Scarborough Shoal. The story is who can operate around it, who can challenge that operation, and how much pressure both sides can apply before an encounter becomes something neither government can easily control. Because the most dangerous development around Scarborough may not be a deliberate attack. It may be the moment when a warning becomes an interception becomes a collision, and a gray zone confrontation suddenly becomes a crisis. Scarborough Shoal has always been small on the map, but the number of military, political, and strategic calculations now converging around it is getting much larger. And the real test will be whether China and the Philippines can keep competing for control without allowing one dangerous encounter in the air or at sea to push them across the line they are both trying to avoid.